I was halfway through fixing the gutters when I heard the shouting. It was coming from the front yard, sharp and angry. I dropped my tools and rushed down the ladder, my boots hitting the pavement hard. There, standing on my driveway, was Brenda, my 21-year-old sister, her dark eyes burning with anger. And across from her stood the HOA president, Margaret Holloway, a middle-aged tyrant in a pastel cardigan with a clipboard clutched in one hand and an overpriced self-published book in the other. "I told you I'm not interested," Brenda said, crossing her arms. Margaret's lips thinned. "It's for the community, dear. Everyone else has done their part." Brenda scoffed. "No, Margaret, it's for you. I don't need a book about the art of HOA leadership written by you." Margaret's face turned an unnatural shade of red. "Excuse me." I stepped forward, clearing my throat. "Is there a problem here?" Margaret turned to me, her expression smoothing into something fake and condescending. "Nathan, dear, your sister is refusing to support the HOA's literacy initiative." "Literacy initiative," I repeated. "Margaret, you're trying to force people to buy your book." She sniffed. "It's a valuable resource." "I don't want it," Brenda shot back. Margaret's fingers tightened around the book. "You don't get to decide that. Everyone in this neighborhood contributes. That's how communities work." Brenda laughed. "Right, communities. You mean your little dictatorship where we all fund your nonsense." Margaret's jaw clenched. "You have a real attitude problem, young lady." Brenda rolled her eyes and turned to walk away. That's when it happened. A sharp crack echoed through the air. Margaret had slapped her. For a second, everything froze. Brenda's head snapped to the side, her hand flying to her cheek. My breath left my lungs in a rush, and my hands curled into fists. Brenda looked up stunned, and the moment she did, her expression changed. Her face went pale. I followed her gaze straight to the security camera mounted on the garage. The red light blinked. It had caught everything. Margaret turned too, and as soon as she saw it, her mouth fell open. Her whole body stiffened. She was screwed. Margaret's entire body went rigid as she stared at the security camera blinking on the garage wall. The weight of what she had just done settled over her like a collapsing house of cards. Brenda touched her cheek, her fingers shaking slightly, but her expression shifted from shock to something colder, something resolute. Margaret forced a tight, fake smile, her voice suddenly softer, almost pleading. "Now, let's not be hasty. No need to blow this out of proportion." Brenda scoffed, her hand dropping from her face. "Blow this out of proportion? You just hit me because I wouldn't buy your stupid book." Margaret's fingers clenched around her clipboard, her knuckles turning white. It was a misunderstanding. I simply meant to gesture and... I cut her off, my voice steady but firm. "Save it, the camera doesn't lie." Her eyes darted between us, then flicked back to the camera. She was calculating, trying to find an escape route, but there wasn't one. Brenda's voice dropped lower, controlled but furious. "You think because you run the HOA, you can do whatever you want. You think you can intimidate people into buying your garbage." Margaret inhaled sharply, her facade cracking. "I was just trying to encourage community participation." I folded my arms. "Encouragement doesn't involve assault, Margaret." Her jaw tightened. "Perhaps we should discuss this reasonably. There's no need to involve anyone else." Brenda let out a short laugh. "Oh, you'd love that, wouldn't you? Just brush it under the rug and pretend it never happened." Margaret's eyes flickered with frustration. "I'm saying we can come to an arrangement. No one needs to make this a bigger issue than it is." I tilted my head. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" She hesitated, then forced another saccharine smile. "Well, perhaps a donation to the community fund, a gesture of goodwill." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "You're trying to bribe us." Margaret's smile faltered, but she pressed on. "Not at all. Just a contribution to ensure harmony in the neighborhood. No need for unnecessary drama." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "You think you can just throw money at this and make it disappear?" Margaret's lips thinned. "I think we all benefit from keeping things civil." Brenda crossed her arms. "You weren't too worried about civility when you slapped me." Margaret's nostrils flared, realizing she was losing control of the situation. "Fine," she snapped. "What do you want?" Brenda glanced at me, then turned back to Margaret. "We want accountability, and that means everyone in the neighborhood is going to know exactly what you did." Margaret's face darkened. "You wouldn't dare." I pulled out my phone, tapping the screen. "Oh, I'd say we absolutely would." Margaret's eyes widened as she realized what I was doing. "You're bluffing." I turned the screen toward her. The footage played in crisp detail: the slap, the stunned silence, her immediate panic. Every second of it was recorded. Her face drained of color. "You can't." Brenda tilted her head. "Can't what? Show people the truth." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her clipboard, as if holding onto it would somehow restore her authority. "This could ruin me," she whispered. Brenda's eyes flashed. "Good." Margaret's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. "Please, there must be another way." I exchanged a glance with Brenda, then I turned back to Margaret. "You're going to call an emergency HOA meeting tonight, and you're going to admit what you did." Margaret recoiled. "Absolutely not." Brenda stepped forward. "Then we'll make sure every single homeowner sees this footage." Margaret's breath came faster, her carefully constructed image crumbling before our eyes. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. She was trapped, and she knew it. After a long silence, she exhaled shakily. "Fine," she muttered, "tonight." Brenda's expression didn't soften. "And you're stepping down." Margaret's head snapped up. "What?" "You heard me," Brenda said. "You don't get to run this neighborhood after what you did." Margaret's fingers twitched. "You can't force me out." I raised an eyebrow. "You really think the community is going to want you in charge after they see this?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She had no power left. Brenda turned toward the house. "We'll see you at the meeting." Margaret stood there, frozen, as we walked away. She had spent years ruling this neighborhood like a queen, but tonight her reign was coming to an end, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. The meeting was set for 8 that evening at the community center. Brenda and I arrived 10 minutes early, but the place was already packed. Word had spread fast. Neighbors who usually avoided HOA meetings like the plague were here, whispering in hushed tones, eyes darting toward the front of the room where Margaret sat stiffly in her usual spot. Her clipboard was gone, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were almost white. The air felt heavy, charged with something electric, an anticipation that only built as more people trickled in. I spotted Mr. Patel from 2 doors down, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The Winstons, an older couple, sat near the back, whispering to each other. Even Greg, the guy who never mowed his lawn and usually ignored all HOA nonsense, was here, leaning against the wall with his arms folded. Brenda nudged me, tilting her head toward the front. Margaret wasn't alone. Her right-hand enforcer, Linda, was seated beside her, her usual smugness replaced with something more cautious. Margaret had clearly brought backup, but it wouldn't be enough. The chatter died down when Margaret cleared her throat. She stood, straightening her cardigan, as if that would somehow restore the authority she had lost. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice strained but still carrying that forced politeness she always used when trying to manipulate a situation. "I wanted to address some concerns that have been raised regarding an unfortunate misunderstanding that occurred earlier today." A scoff came from the back of the room. Margaret's eyes flickered toward the sound, but she pressed on. "It seems there has been some misinterpretation of my actions, and I would like the opportunity to clarify." Brenda stepped forward, cutting her off. "Misinterpretation?" Her voice carried through the room, sharp and clear. "You slapped me, Margaret. That's not a misunderstanding. That's assault." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Margaret's lips pressed together briefly before she forced another strained smile. "I admit that emotions ran high," she said, her tone carefully measured, "and for that I sincerely apologize. However, I think we can all agree that this doesn't have to become more than it is." I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up. "You mean you hope it doesn't, but the problem is, Margaret, we have proof, and we're not the only ones who have had issues with you throwing your weight around." A few heads nodded. Someone muttered, "Finally someone saying it." Margaret's nostrils flared. "Nathan, let's be reasonable." Brenda cut in again. "Reasonable, like you were earlier when you tried to bribe us to keep quiet, or when you told me I didn't have a choice because everyone contributes to your little empire." A few gasps echoed through the crowd. Margaret's mask cracked for a brief moment, panic flickering in her eyes. Linda shifted beside her, visibly uncomfortable now that the tide was turning. "I think it's time we hear from the community," I said, "because Brenda and I aren't the only ones who have been pushed around." Silence stretched for a beat before Mr. Patel spoke up. "She fined me $500 last year for having the wrong shade of mulch in my front yard. $500, and when I contested it, she said I could either pay or face further consequences." That opened the floodgates. Mrs. Winston raised her hand. She threatened to revoke our parking permits because we refused to donate to her neighborhood beautification project. Greg, arms still crossed, shook his head. She tried to tell me I had to repaint my house because she didn't like the color, said it disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the street. I told her it was my house, and she sent me 3 violation notices in 1 week. More voices joined in. Stories of intimidation, excessive fines, arbitrary rules that benefited Margaret and her cronies but punished everyone else. The atmosphere shifted from tension to something sharper: outrage, a collective realization that no one had to put up with this anymore. Margaret's face had gone pale. She glanced at Linda, but Linda was already shrinking back, clearly realizing that siding with Margaret tonight was a sinking ship. Brenda folded her arms. "You don't run this neighborhood, Margaret. You work for us, and we're done letting you treat us like we're your personal bank account." Margaret straightened, grasping at the last remnants of her authority. "This meeting is getting out of hand. If there are issues, they should be addressed through proper channels." Greg let out a short, humorless laugh. "You mean the channels you control? Yeah, I don't think so." I turned to the crowd. "We have a choice here. We can let Margaret keep running things, or we can take back our community. We have the power to remove her. All we need is a majority vote." Margaret's eyes widened. "You can't." Brenda raised an eyebrow. "Actually, we can. It's in the bylaws. And I think after everything that's been said tonight, we all know how this is going to go." The room fell silent for a beat, then Mr. Patel spoke again. "All in favor of removing Margaret Holloway from her position as HOA president?" Hands shot up, dozens of them, more than enough. Margaret's breath hitched. She looked around, desperation creeping into her expression as she realized there was no way out. Linda stood abruptly. "I think I'll be resigning as well." She grabbed her purse and made a beeline for the door, leaving Margaret alone at the front of the room. Brenda met Margaret's eyes. "Looks like you're out of a job." Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in years, she had nothing to say. The meeting ended with cheers and relieved laughter. People lingered, talking about what came next, who would take over, how they could make things better. The neighborhood had woken up, and there was no going back. As Brenda and I stepped outside, she let out a long breath. That felt good. I grinned, justice usually does. The streetlights cast a soft glow over the sidewalk as we walked home, the echoes of the night still buzzing in our ears. Margaret had ruled with fear, but in the end, all it took was one mistake and a community that had finally had enough. And just like that, the HOA had a new future one, without Margaret Holloway. As Brenda and I walked back home, the night air carried an unusual feeling of finality. The community had spoken, and Margaret was no longer in control. It was a victory, but something about the way she had sat there, silent and stiff, gnawed at me. Margaret wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Brenda stretched her arms above her head as we reached the driveway. "That was satisfying," she said. "I thought she was going to explode." I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. "She's not done," I muttered. Brenda kicked off her shoes and flopped onto the couch. "She doesn't have any power left." I wasn't so sure. Margaret had spent years tightening her grip on this neighborhood. Losing that control wasn't something she would just accept. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Brenda groaning in frustration. I walked into the kitchen to find her standing by the window, gripping her phone. "Tell me I'm imagining things," she said, pointing outside. I followed her gaze and immediately felt my stomach tighten. Margaret was standing at the edge of our property, clipboard in hand, talking to a man in a suit. Brenda crossed her arms. "She's up to something." The man nodded as Margaret gestured toward our house, her expression intense. After a few moments, he handed her a piece of paper and walked away. Margaret remained there for a few seconds longer before turning on her heel and marching back toward her own house. Brenda frowned. She didn't even look at us. I grabbed my phone. I'm going to find out what she's planning. By the time I reached the sidewalk, Margaret was unlocking her front door. I called her name, and she hesitated before turning to face me. She folded her arms. "What do you want?" I nodded toward the man she had been speaking with. "Who was that?" Margaret's lips pressed together. "None of your business." Brenda appeared beside me. "Everything you do is our business now. You don't have your little kingdom anymore." Margaret's expression remained neutral, but there was something in her eyes, something cold. I stepped closer. "If you're planning something, you might as well say it now." She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. "Nathan, I don't hold grudges. I believe in moving forward, but actions have consequences, and you'll learn that soon enough." Brenda let out a dry laugh. "That's adorable. You still think you're in charge." Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked inside, shutting the door firmly behind her. Brenda exhaled. She's planning something. I nodded, and we need to figure out what before she tries to make our lives miserable. That afternoon, I decided to visit Mr. Patel. He had been one of the first people to speak up against Margaret, and he had lived in the neighborhood long enough to know how she operated. If anyone had insight into her next move, it was him. When I knocked on his door, he opened it almost immediately. He looked tired but determined. "I was expecting you," he said. I stepped inside, and he led me to his dining room table, where a stack of HOA documents sat neatly piled. "She's going to fight back," he said before I could even ask. I nodded. "She already is. She had some guy in a suit at our house this morning." Mr. Patel's expression darkened. That was probably an attorney. Brenda, who had followed me inside, frowned. What could she possibly sue us for? Mr. Patel sighed. "Margaret doesn't need a real reason. She just needs to make things difficult for you. She's been in power too long. She knows how to manipulate the system." I picked up one of the documents on the table. "What's this?" He tapped the stack. "Everything I've collected on her over the years. Fines that didn't make sense, money that disappeared from the HOA funds, complaints that were buried." Brenda raised an eyebrow. "You've been keeping records." Mr. Patel nodded. "I never had enough people willing to stand against her before, but now we do." I flipped through the papers. Margaret had been worse than I thought. Brenda leaned against the table. "So what do we do with this?" Mr. Patel's gaze was steady. "We end her grip on this neighborhood for good." That evening, I sat in the living room, going through the documents while Brenda scrolled through her phone. She suddenly sat up straight. "She's trying to challenge the vote," Brenda said. I looked up. "What?" Brenda turned her phone toward me. It was a post from the neighborhood's online forum. Margaret had written a long message claiming that the vote to remove her was illegitimate, that she was still the rightful HOA president, and that a new vote would be held under proper supervision. I clenched my jaw. "She's trying to claw her way back in." Brenda shook her head. "She can't just undo what happened." "She can try," I muttered. Brenda stood. "Then we stop her before she gets any traction." I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Patel. "We need a meeting tonight." By the time the sun had set, nearly the entire neighborhood was gathered on Mr. Patel's lawn. People were angry. They had seen Margaret's post and they weren't buying it. Greg stood with his arms crossed. "She's delusional if she thinks she's still in charge." Mrs. Winston nodded. "We need to make it clear that she's done." Mr. Patel cleared his throat. "Nathan, Brenda, tell them what you found." I held up the stack of documents. "Margaret's been playing dirty for years. We have proof of missing funds, bogus fines, and now we know she's trying to find a legal loophole to stay in power." Brenda stepped forward. "We need to make sure she can't manipulate her way back in." Greg nodded. "Then we take this to the city, file a formal complaint." Mr. Patel smiled. "I already have an attorney lined up. If Margaret wants to play legal games, we'll fight back." For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't divided. We were united, and Margaret was about to learn that she had pushed people too far. As the meeting ended, Brenda turned to me. "You were right, she wasn't going down without a fight." I looked toward Margaret's house where the lights were still on. "Then we make sure she loses." The next morning, I woke up to a knock at the door. Brenda was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, but she didn't move to answer it. We exchanged a look before I set down my phone and walked to the door. When I opened it, a man in a gray suit stood there, holding a folder. He adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Nathan Carter?" he asked. I nodded, already bracing myself. "That's me." He handed me the folder. "You've been formally served. Have a good day." I took the folder, and before I could say anything, he turned and walked back to his car. Brenda appeared beside me, peering over my shoulder. "What is it?" she asked. I flipped open the folder, scanning the first page. My stomach tightened. "Margaret's suing us." Brenda let out a short, humorless laugh. "For what?" "Exposing her." I read further, my jaw tightening. "Defamation, harassment, and interfering with HOA operations." Brenda snatched the document from my hand, scanning the words herself. "She has to be joking." I rubbed my temples. "She's not. This is exactly what Mr. Patel warned us about. She's trying to bury us in legal trouble." Brenda tossed the papers onto the counter. "She can't win this." I exhaled sharply. She doesn't have to, she just has to make it a nightmare for us. Before we could think too much about it, my phone buzzed. It was Mr. Patel. I answered immediately. She got you too, he asked. I glanced at the folder. Yeah, she's suing us. She's suing half the neighborhood, he said. I've gotten calls all morning. She's targeting everyone who voted her out. Brenda's eyebrows shot up. She's trying to intimidate us. Mr. Patel's voice was calm but firm. She's desperate. She thinks if she can scare enough people, she can make them back down. I clenched my jaw. What's our next move? I already called the lawyer, Mr. Patel said. He's filing a motion to dismiss, but we need to meet tonight. This is bigger than just you two. Brenda crossed her arms. She's trying to punish everyone for standing up to her. She is, Mr. Patel agreed, but she just made a mistake. She went too far. After we ended the call, I turned to Brenda. We need to talk to as many people as possible before tonight. Make sure no one caves to her pressure. Brenda grabbed her keys. Let's go. We spent the rest of the day knocking on doors, speaking to neighbors who had also been served. Some were angry, others were nervous, but no one wanted to give in. She can't afford to take us all to court, Greg said when we stopped by his house. She's bluffing. She's hoping some of us settle, I said. If she can get a few people to back down, she'll use that as leverage. Mr. Winston, who had been quiet at the HOA meeting, rubbed his chin. She's hoping to break us apart. Brenda nodded, then we don't let her. By the time the meeting started that evening, the tension was thick. Mr. Patel stood at the front of his living room, the lawyer beside him. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, didn't waste any time. This lawsuit is a scare tactic, she said. She doesn't have a legal leg to stand on. If we fight, she'll lose. Mrs. Winston wrung her hands. But what if she drags this out? Won't that cost us money? Sarah nodded. It could, but here's the thing, Margaret doesn't have unlimited resources either. The more people who stand against her, the harder it will be for her to keep up the fight. Greg crossed his arms, so we hold the line. Exactly, Sarah said. I'm filing a counterclaim. If she wants to play dirty, we'll hit back harder. The room buzzed with murmurs. People were scared, but they were also angry. Margaret had ruled through intimidation for too long. Brenda leaned forward. What happens if she loses? Sarah's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Then she'll have to pay for all of this. A ripple of satisfaction spread through the room. She wanted a fight, I said. She's about to get one. The next day, we made sure everyone who had been served knew what was happening. Sarah filed the counterclaim, and suddenly, Margaret wasn't just on the attack, she was on the defensive. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one holding all the power. The lawsuit was a desperate move, a final attempt to claw back the control Margaret had lost, but the neighborhood had changed. People weren't afraid anymore. They were angry, and that made all the difference. Sarah worked fast. Within days, the counterclaim was filed, and Margaret was served with her own legal notice. Now, she wasn't just attacking us, she had to defend herself. I was outside repairing a section of my fence when Greg stopped by, hands in his pockets. She got served this morning, he said. I wiped the sweat from my brow. How'd she take it? Greg let out a dry chuckle, didn't say a word, just snatched the papers and slammed the door. Brenda leaned against the porch railing. She's realizing she picked a fight she can't win. Greg nodded. She wanted to scare us. Now she's the one on the ropes. As the days passed, Margaret's presence in the neighborhood changed. She wasn't walking around with her clipboard anymore. There were no more passive-aggressive emails, no sudden fines appearing in people's mailboxes. She was quiet, too quiet. Then late one evening, Brenda nudged me while we sat in the living room. Look at this. She handed me her phone. It was an email from Margaret sent to every homeowner. It was long-winded, full of flowery language about community harmony and how the legal battle was draining resources better spent on improving the neighborhood. But the core message was clear: she was trying to settle. Brenda scoffed. She's trying to back out without admitting she lost. I read through it again. She's offering to drop the lawsuit if we drop the counterclaim. Brenda crossed her arms, so she can just walk away without consequences. No chance. Greg called a neighborhood meeting the next night at his place. People showed up in droves, tired but determined. She wants to settle, I told the crowd. Mr. Patel shook his head. She wants to escape accountability. Mrs. Winston frowned. If we let her walk away without consequences, what's stopping the next HOA president from doing the same thing? Sarah stood at the front of the room, arms folded. You have leverage. She's the one who initiated the lawsuit, and now she's the one trying to get out of it. That means she knows she's going to lose. Brenda leaned forward, so what do we do? Sarah smiled, we don't settle unless it's on our terms. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Mr. Patel nodded. She needs to be removed from the HOA board entirely. No loopholes, no way back in. Greg added, and she needs to return the money she misused from the HOA fund. Sarah nodded. If she agrees to those terms, I'll draft the paperwork. Brenda smirked, and if she does. Sarah's expression was calm but firm. Then we take this to court, and she loses everything. The neighborhood voted unanimously. The next morning, Sarah sent Margaret the terms. For the first time in weeks, we didn't hear a word from her. No emails, no statements, nothing. It was as if she had disappeared. Then 3 days later, Sarah received a response. Margaret agreed to the terms. Brenda read the email over my shoulder and let out a slow breath. She folded. I nodded. She didn't have a choice. The final meeting was held at the community center. Margaret sat stiffly at the front as Sarah read the agreement aloud. She would resign from the HOA board immediately, repay the misused funds, and withdraw her lawsuit. In exchange, we would drop the counterclaim. Brenda watched her closely. You thought you could bully us forever, didn't you? Margaret didn't respond. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Greg shook his head. You ran this place like your own personal kingdom. Now look where you are. For the first time, Margaret looked truly defeated. She signed the agreement without a word. Sarah took the papers, checked them over, then nodded. It's done. A wave of relief passed through the room. Brenda exhaled, finally. As people began to leave, Greg clapped me on the shoulder. You and Brenda started this. You made people realize they didn't have to be afraid. I shook my head. We all did this together. Brenda grinned, and now we have a neighborhood that actually belongs to us. Margaret slipped out quietly, her reign officially over. The community had won.